is the ninth generation the most boring generation of gaming that we've had? I feel like the question can also be rephrased as, is it the most disappointing? And if that's the question, it's an overwhelming yes. I feel like most people can say in some capacity, some shape or form. But is this current generation of gaming like the most boring? Disappointing, I would say absolutely. Because like, it's kind of interesting. You look at all three major companies, right, with consoles. You have Nintendo with the Switch, who's done incredible in terms of sales, but it's obviously very much overstayed its welcome. And now we're finally going to get the Switch 2 for the ninth generation here sometime this year. But even still, when we get it, we're still going to have some older hardware. The problem that we have with the Switch, we're going to have again with the Switch 2 in like what, 4 or 5 years, whatever. And then you have Xbox, who's delayed everything, and at this point is going full multi-plat and is basically going to become just a publisher. And then you have Sony, who went all in on live service and has had failures and cancellations nonstop. So it's just like, is this the most boring generation that we've had? That's where it's kind of like, it depends on how you look at the games that has come out. But in the question of disappointment, the answer is an overwhelming yes. I was just kind of curious you guys' thoughts.
It's a weird thing to try to say that it's like a boring. I mean, like somewhat recency bias, but then also like I'll bring up a big example of non-recency bias when we've had like over the last year or so, especially like games come out that just explode and take off. Like think of Helldivers 2. And that is like currently like Kingdom Come Deliverance 2.
Black Myth
It,
Wukong.
it's like is taken over. Black Myth Wukong took over the world. And then it's like it's been a few years, but you got to think back. Elden Ring.
Yeah.
Elden Ring is still a staple, and it's like it's still one that people are like clamoring for content of. So it's weird to say it's a boring generation or like a disappointing generation when there have been multiple games in the past few years that are kind of like generation defining games.
Yeah, I'm sort of with John on that. I mean, in terms of like the generation as a whole, I personally would not say it is necessarily a disappointing generation. If we're talking like specifically this generation's like exclusives, I would say it's probably one of the very disappointing.
Yeah.
And whatnot, and sort of lackluster for the most part, just because we had one side which we're finally getting at the end of what seems like the ninth generation, and the other side they front loaded all their ones, and now we got Jack All for the in here in terms of just exclusives, and overall the generation itself. I mean, I wouldn't say it's the worst because I mean it's had its just about every generation for the most part has its hits and misses. Because I mean overall spread, I mean it's been an okay generation. I mean we've gotten several, as John mentioned, defining games across what's considered the ninth generation, as well as some more. I'm thinking, trying to phrase as. I guess necessarily progress with other things, such as like the VR's come a long way with during this generation of gaming.
That's true. Yeah.
And whatnot. This generation of game was also unfortunately hit with the 2020 plague, which killed us for like 3 years.
Yep.
So I mean,
And that's when the generation launched too. Let's not forget that.
so I mean, the generation did sort of suffer in that in terms of that, just due to pandemic, unfortunately, which pushed everyone back, which we couldn't really do a bunch of, no one could do anything about.
Right.
It pushed a bunch of people back and also got several games canceled and developers shut down and whatnot during that when no one could work.
Right.
So, I mean, I would definitely not say it is a like luster generation in my mind, just because we do have had quite a number of games as well as roster that, and like next generation people will definitely be looking at and being like, when are we getting that again?
Right. Right.
Well, I do also have a counterpoint to it being a disappointment of a generation, and that is like there have been plenty of games that have come out that are not they're dual generation because they refuse to give up on the previous generation.
Yes.
Like some of the other big hitters that have come out, the God of War Ragnarok. I forget. It was Last of Us 2. Was that last generation?
That was last.
It originally launched on the PS4.
Yeah, and it's like games like that they've been trying to get up, but it's been taking forever for them to actually do. This been like games refuse to stop like launching on previous generations.
Yeah. Now that's actually something I saw that was someone pointed out where it's like it's just crazy that we're still getting PS4 games at this point. For just as an example.
I mean it's one where we get it. You sold what, like 100 and something million PS4s. You haven't sold that many PS5s. You still want to get the money out of it. But you're holding the generation up.
Yeah.
It's like you can't make a game you can't make the game for the new generation if you're holding on to the old generation. It's like that's been a staple of like this current generation is everybody's still trying to make it for the old one because for some reason they can't let go of the fact that look how many we sold before. We need that money.
Right.
It's like most people if most people it's like people that are on PS5. Yeah, we have PS4 still, but I'm not buying anything for PS4. It's like my PS4 hadn't been turned on in years.
Yeah.
On the other side of that, in terms of if we're looking at the generation as a whole and not just the big hitters, it's definitely been a nice little generation for indie developers and just rising up.
This has 100% been the generation of indie devs taking over.
Because a lot of the games that have been large, big hitters or taken over and whatnot have been just indie games that have just come out of nowhere. Like one that I think that's brought up a whole new genre of games is content warning. Just a dumb party game where you have a dumb camp recorder and you go out on the map just to find wild stuff the developers just left in there, and it spawned a whole new sort of genre of games. And then we got Baldur's Gate 3 during this, which we got just a lot. That was a whole thing of just Baldur's Gate 3 just being a game that people were like, this is a stable how games should be. And then the industry going, you shouldn't expect that just because this is a very specialized game.
Right, yeah.
And just its whole thing. So,
yeah. Which is one where it's still wild that like before Baldur's Gate came out, we still had developers going like, hey, don't expect games to be like Baldur's Gate. It's like, what do you mean? Like polished?
Yeah.
Completed?
No, exactly.
It's like done?
It's like a complete game, and then it's like when bugs are found. Like even now, when a patch for Baldur's Gate comes out, it comes out with a list of like 300 line items of bug fixes of the most minuscule things.
Yeah.
And it's like why should the standard not be release a good polished game anymore? Mm-hmm. It's like stop trying to sell me a 10-hour game and charging me $70 for it.
Right.
It's like I can go spend like $40 and buy Helldivers 2 and get hundreds of hours out of that game.
And which, speaking of Helldivers 2, also makes this generation, in terms at least from like the content and whatnot I see, almost seems the socialization of games has been slightly coming back, because a lot of the big game hitters are things that catch people's attention with streaming and whatnot are sort of games that require a bit of socialization, like Helldivers 2. A lot of people, that community in itself is just sort of ridiculous.
Yeah.
And just how the developers help handle the order missions and whatnot, and just how the players, they go for it almost every time, except recently where they screwed up and got a planet destroyed. But hey,
sometimes you gotta rebel.
And things like that, because I've definitely seen a lot more games that require like some socialization, because like there's one game on Steam, I can't think of what the name is off the top of my head, but it's literally just a game where you create a lobby, you can invite people, and people just fish.
Oh, yeah, I think it's called web fishing.
Yes, that's exactly it.
So let me ask you guys a question, because it's something that you said. It sparked the question in my brain. you said that you wouldn't call it the worst generation. I was curious, what do you guys' take is what would be the worst generation, not counting the super early ones, because that's kind of I pulled them up, and if I think there's an obvious one, I'd give it to Generation 4, which was literally just like the OG Game Boy, the Game Gear, the Atari Lynx, and what console called the Turbo Express. That's all fourth gen was. So like not counting the super early.
That's pretty rough.
That's kind of unfair to put it on them. Let's start with 5, which would be like PlayStation, N64, shit like that, and kind of moving forward. What would be the worst in you guys' opinion? I was just kind of curious.
8.
Wow.
Yes!
Okay. All right.
I was thinking very similar, if I'm being honest.
Oh,
If we're
eighth
talking,
generation.
like modern day generations, 8, because 8 almost killed Microsoft.
Yep.
And it's like it pushed everybody to it pushed the large population of gamers to PS4, but we went to PS4 just because like they had more games coming out, not because it was necessarily a fantastic generation.
And
It's like a lot of good games came out, but it's not like you look at Generation 8 as the year that Sony came back with the PS4 because Xbox nearly killed itself.
And yeah, and I was also thinking that because they also other aspect of that is like some people didn't even really want to do the PS4 originally just because of PS3 and the experience that was the PS3.
Yeah,
It's
right.
like you can't say 7 because that's a 360 generation, which is
And Wii.
like it's like a 360 Wii generation, which is arguably the best.
Yeah.
And it's
The
like
only-
before that you have like PS2 and
Xbox.
Xbox, which is like
GameCube,
which is like nobody's ever gonna say that like that's also
In
an
our
argument for
generation,
best.
yeah.
I mean, the only dark horse of Generation 7 was the PS3, but the Wii and Xbox 360 luckily were enough
Yeah,
to.
carries it.
Yes.
See, just saying Generation 8 is interesting because not only did it have a console that almost killed Xbox, it also had the console that almost killed Nintendo because Wii U is considered Generation 8, but Nintendo Switch is considered Generation 8, but that one's kind of a cross.
Yeah.
So that's why it kind of gets out a little bit, you know? But I think Generation 8 is probably a fair answer because, yeah, you got the Switch, right? Cool. You got the PS4, cool, but you have the Wii U and the Xbox, which almost killed both brands respectively.
Well, yeah.
Like,
I mean,
it's kind of crazy to think
And the
about.
thing with that, the Xbox One, the whole thing, like they trashed like several of the big things they originally had for the consoles and whatnot. Like the whole voice command and Kinect was going to be a whole thing.
That and just the online stuff because
Yep.
So that actually popped up as a short for me recently, where it was the head at the time, where it's just like, well, the single line that almost killed Xbox and killed the console, where it's just like, well, if you don't want to be online all the time, we do have an alternative solution. It's called the Xbox 360. And I'm like, oh my god, I forgot he said that. It's like that line almost killed Xbox up front.
Yeah. I mean, the Generation 8 had some stuff going for it.
Yeah.
I mean, it is kind of the intro, like, especially like towards the end of the life cycle of it. I mean, we had God of War, we had like Red Dead Redemption,
Spider-Man.
like 2, Spider-Man, like Last of Us. We had all of that stuff coming out towards like the ending cycle of that, which is
Ghost of Tsushima.
yeah, it's like that's the stuff that people would look at and be like, what do you mean that's a great generation? It's like, okay, what on Xbox side of it? What did Nintendo do during that
I
time?
was about to say, Generation X had a nice little bow tie at the end to make it look very nice.
Yes.
If you really look through that generation from beginning to end, the beginning to middle part, you're sort of like,
Yeah.
even with the PS4 carrying
yeah, because
it, PS4 also was a bit choppy releases up until that end.
yeah,
Right.
it was like a lot of us switched over to PS4. Not necessarily because the PS4 was fantastic. It was just because the Xbox was extremely lackluster.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's like, if I'm going to buy stuff, why not buy it for the one that's actually getting some games come out for it?
Right. No, I think 8 is probably the correct answer. It's really interesting when you look at all the modern day generations. I think there's a very firm argument that you could say 8 or 9 is the worst. I think it's a firm argument for both, but I think I'm gonna side with 8 because again, you had the 2 consoles that almost killed 2 brands.
Yeah,
it's
I
kind of
don't-
hard to fight against that.
It's one where I mean, I don't. It's one where, like, if you were to try to say 9 is one of the worst, it's hard in my mind to do that because it's impossible for me to distinguish like the generation 9 from like current gaming, because in current gaming, we've talked about this before. Modern gaming is in one of the best states that it's ever been for anybody to play games.
Oh yes.
And it's hard to distinguish that and say Gen 9 doesn't in some way contribute to that. Because it may not, it's like you may not have like the best releases. It may have taken a long time for the generation to get there. They may have held on to the previous generation for too long. But at the end of the day, more people are playing games than ever.
Yeah, and just this generation 9 in just terms of releases, I thought like it just very much diversified. I mean, we had VR has come a long way.
Yep.
Mobile games have had a resurgence exceptionally well
Yep.
during this generation. Of course, we got our PS5, which is the creme de la creme of just, hey, we don't have enough things to push this any harder. And Xbox, I mean, they've been having it rough, but I mean, their console itself is a fantastic piece of hardware.
Yeah, it's a great piece of hardware.
I mean, their console itself, like, if the Series S wasn't there,
I think.
if the Series S wasn't there, Xbox was set up for a home run.
Yeah.
With the power of the Series X and like what was capable on it. The problem is they didn't get any games because they had to develop it for both systems and people just couldn't do it.
Yep.
As John said many times, the S was a fantastic consumer move. Was not a fantastic developer move.
No, it was not.
Because because that's one of the things that's put Xbox behind so much is just all the developers having to make the game for X, which they could do with no issue because it was fairly similar
Powerful,
build to the PS5, and then they look to the X and go, "We got to do a whole other team for this."
Yeah, it's like we got to hire an entirely different team for this bad boy. What are we doing?
Yeah.
They're dealing with the same problems as people still making games on the Switch.
Yeah, for real. And like I said earlier, we're gonna have that same problem with the Switch 2 here in like 4 years.
I've got it predicted for it to happen immediately.
Oh no!
Remember, that's one of my yearly predictions.
I know. God, I hope not.
But yeah, no, like I said, it's hard to distinguish and try to say that Generation 9 is disappointing because it's like gaming is in such a great state. It's like consoles are a large part of that, and it's like we have games come out that are breaking records, and it's like we have games blowing up beyond anything we could have thought happened a couple years ago. It's partially due to because of this generation.
And hell, we've even had handheld gaming come back.
Yeah, true. Handheld gaming has had a massive resurgence.
I mean, hell, just look back to like last year. College football came out. That game came out, and it's like that sold consoles.
Yep.
It's like that's not
Crazy.
a game you would think would sell consoles, but that game came out, sold consoles, and then the people that I personally know people that bought consoles because of that game who are now playing a bunch of other games. It's like they hadn't played games in years.
Yeah.
They bought it for college football, and now because they have access to it,
Yeah, they're like, well, I got this thing.
it's like they have access to it, so now they're playing. They're like, this is a whole new world that's opened up. They're like, when I used to play games, it wasn't anything like this.
Right.
And it's like, part of that is due to like the nature of like some live service games that are successful in that. But it's also a large part due to like the console marketplace and people keeping those games alive because there's something to play.
Yeah.
Which is you don't have that without this generation.
True.
Like you wouldn't be playing a bunch of these live service games like back during the last generation.
Right. Yeah. No, and that's the fair defense for the 9th gen. 9th gen can just get that quick like knee-jerk reaction because of the Series S and just how bad the Xbox sales are. Xbox going publisher mode basically, and all the cancellations. But there's so many
insane
other
amount of delays we had at the beginning of the generation.
but there's so many other positives to happen for it. But I will say this, and I've said it before, and I'm gonna continue to stay in my boat, even though I know it's not gonna happen. I'm still under a very firm belief that like I think it'd be great for the generation, just extend the generation. I don't think it needs to be a standard 7-year cycle.
I mean, we've all been in
Yeah.
agreement.
Yeah. I just know there's people, it's just like, nah, go ahead and just do the 7-year, whatever. I'm just like, no. I think it should be extended. Because like there's nothing that's pushing these consoles to the
Well, that's the
limit.
thing. The only reason we were anywhere close to 7 years before was because in that time frame they learned how to extract every piece of hardware that the console had for
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
We haven't been able to push anything yet.
Yep. Yep. So
But yeah, I will say, like, as much as I'm defending Generation 9, it probably is in, like,
it's in the bottom half.
It is 8 and 9 that are probably towards the bottom of it. But that's because you look back at like the 360 generation, the PS2 generation. It's like those are so like lauded for like the golden era of gaming.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Because
just
it's
everything that was coming out and whatnot. Yeah.
Because it's like we're in like 2025, and it's like, what are a lot of the big releases that are coming out? They're remakes of that time.
Facts, and it's not going to stop anytime soon.
It's like
No.
it's like we're remaking games from the PS2, the GameCube, like
Xbox.
Xbox. It's like
Yeah.
we're remaking those games because it's like people haven't experienced them. They've heard about them, but they don't want to go back and play it on the old hardware.
Right.
So remake it, play it. It's like sell a million copies. Do it
Yeah.
again.
Yep.
Everyone's just taking the Nintendo strategy.
Hey, it prints dollars. It prints dollars.